Fossil fuels are, by definition, according to Science Daily, a general term for the buried combustible geological deposits of organic material that have been converted to crude oil, coal, natural gas by exposure to heat, pressure in the Earth's crust over hundreds of millions of years. End quote. Renewable resources can effectively replace fossil fuels as the world's primary source of energy, and this global switch can lead to substantial decrease in climate change. Renewable resources is any form of energy generation that is not entirely depleted when it's used and can be replenished in a relatively short time frame. The most popular and sustainable of these sources are wind, hydro, and solar power. Prior to the 19th century, nearly all forms of energy were renewable. For example, harnessing wind for shipping vessels and the use of animals such as horses and dogs for drawing one's wares and as modes of transportation. Some people were acutely aware during the rise of fossil fuel that they were not perpetually sustainable. In this debate speech, I'll provide the challenges and defenses of renewable energy. First, I will evaluate the data that the removal of fossil fuel will not reduce CO2 emissions as much as hoped, and second, that the removal would unfairly affect low-income areas. After this, I will showcase the defenses of renewable energy. First, that it is more energy effective and cost effective, and second, that its primary use would generate a positive impact on America's international relationship with the rest of the world. Let's begin by looking at the cons and challenges. According to the International Institute for Applied Systems, in their Science Daily article, quote, removing fossil subsidies will only slightly slow the growth of CO2 emissions, with the result that by 2030 they would only be 1 to 5% lower than if subsidies had been maintained, end quote. The reasoning behind this, according to IIAS researcher Jessica Jewell, is that the subsidies generated apply only to oil, gas, and electricity. This means that in some cases the removal of these could cause an upswing in the switching to cheaper, more emission-intensive, non-renewable resources, the exact opposite effect of what we want. Second, according to Jules, quote, while these subsidies add up to substantial sums of money, the rate per unit of energy is not high enough to have a big effect on global energy demand, end quote. This is because it's cheaper to reduce energy demand than it is to substitute fuel with renewable resources. Next, what we need to consider is the impact this would have on the poor. According to this same Science Daily article, quote, many fossil fuel subsidies were put in place to help those with lower incomes, and despite the fact that most of that money goes to the rich, the poorer you are, the more your household budget comes from these subsidies, so their removal would have a much larger impact on daily life, end quote. This is because removing these non-renewable subsidies that these low-income areas economies have been built around will consequently force these communities to return to fire wood and charcoal, which will in turn emit more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and continue to damage the health of them and the planet. Now that we've discussed the drawbacks facing renewable energy, let's discuss the positive outcomes of this switch. According to the Science Direct article by Rachel Fockrew, quote, renewable energy and energy efficiency avoids many environmental and price validity concerns associated with continual reliance on fossil fuels. And when they are paired with new demand responses and grid planning efforts, they can be every bit as reliable, end quote. Returning to its effects on low-income areas, in the same Science Daily article that I previously evaluated, it also points out that, quote, fortunately the highest number of poor people are concentrated in regions where the removal of subsidies will have the weakest effect on CO2 emissions. Removing subsidies in richer oil and gas exporting regions would therefore provide significantly greater emission savings and have a less detrimental impact on the poor. Well-designed policies can achieve substantial subsidy removal without affecting the poor, end quote. To understand the cost effectiveness, look no further than the Rhode Island and Massachusetts energy experiments. According to Science Direct, quote, these two states have achieved electricity savings close to or over 3% of sales, and have been continually achieving high savings rates for the past few years. In comparison to 20 states that have yet to exceed an annual savings of 0.6 of electricity sales, end quote. Next, to understand the global positive impact, we must look at it through the economic and environmental impacts of renewable energy and its global relevance to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a voluntary United Nations legal agreement that's goal is to combat climate change by, quote, keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2% Celsius and above pre-industrial levels to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 Celsius, to increase the ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change and at making financial flow consistent with low GHG emissions and climate resilient pathway, end quote. The agreement makes sense, economic sense, but it also does in terms of environmental impact. By joining these global coalitions, we not only create an avenue to substantially reduce the world's carbon emission, but we also forge and strengthen our economic relationships with other countries that through a fair and open market will stimulate the economies of each nation. In conclusion, in this debate, I introduced what renewable resources are and a brief history of them. We went over the pros and cons of renewable energy. We went over how the drawbacks, such as the concept that removing fossil fuel will not reduce CO2 emissions as much as expected, and the economic pitfalls that the switch would have in low-income areas. However, we also answered some of these concerns in the pros of renewable energy. I selected this topic because the need to establish a clean environmental future is a belief that I hold strongly, and is one that I try to improve in my own daily life. The need for this change is clear, and according to Science Direct, quote, a build out to clean energy resources will result in significant social, environmental, and economic benefits, end quote. Nonetheless, in the 21st century, the question of switching to a more sustainable, renewable resource is not a question of if, but when. Thank you.